In late August 1914, the Austro-Hungarian First Army won a distinct tactical victory at the Battle of Krasnik. But by aggressively pursuing the retreating Russians northward, they triggered a strategic crisis. General Viktor Dankl commanded this northward push toward Lublin. His rapid advance successfully forced the Russian lines back, but it detached his right flank entirely from the rest of the Austro-Hungarian forces. This map displays the consequence of that fractured line. A sprawling, unprotected void, measuring nearly 50 miles across, opened up between the First Army and the neighboring Fourth Army to the southeast. To plug this massive operational vacuum, command diverted an emergency stopgap force, the German Landwehr Corps, primarily older reserves from Silesia. These older troops were deployed with severe material shortages. The entire corps possessed just 8 machine guns, 0 mobile field kitchens, and virtually no dedicated medical formations. Waiting for them across this void was the Russian Fourth Army, now under the command of General Alexei Evert. Evert had anchored his troops on the high ridges of Tarnawka, establishing a modernized static defense built around artillery. The Central Powers had engineered a fatal mathematical mismatch. They stretched an under-equipped, aging reserve force across an 80-kilometer gap to attack a fully entrenched industrial army holding the high ground. From the crest of the Tarnawka ridges, the Russian gunners had an unobstructed view down a steep, forested slope into the wide agricultural approach lanes. The kinetic engine of General Evert's defense was the 3rd Heavy Artillery Brigade. This wireframe maps Evert's dual-caliber firing geometry, dividing the defensive labor between 2 specific artillery systems. Safely positioned on the reverse slopes, 152mm heavy howitzers fired in high parabolic arcs. Their high explosive shells were coordinated by forward observers to obliterate Austro-Hungarian field fortifications from above. Meanwhile, 76.2mm quick-firing field guns were dug into the military crests. These weapons fired flat, direct trajectories that swept the narrow agricultural corridors with high-velocity shrapnel. For the advancing infantry, the first casualty was their hearing. The high-decibel pressure waves from continuous shell detonations ruptured tympanic membranes, causing acute barotrauma and destroying all verbal tactical communication. Deafened and pinned down, the Austro-Hungarian columns found themselves trapped in dense, waist-high fields of Lublin, unable to move forward or receive retreat orders. This opening barrage shifted the nature of the engagement. The advancing Central Powers were no longer struggling against an opposing infantryman visible across the field, but instead against a pre-registered mathematical grid of flying steel. By September 8th, the Russian 164th and 332nd Infantry Regiments began their advance. They moved in thick skirmish lines through unharvested, high-standing rye fields, using the crops to mask their true numbers. Lacking proper engineering tools, the defending Landwehr and Austro-Hungarian units were forced to adapt the existing agricultural landscape. They used heavy stone walls and farm buildings as makeshift breastworks. This schematic demonstrates a fatal flaw. When high-explosive shells strike brittle masonry, the energy doesn't just destroy the barrier, it creates secondary fragmentation. The stone shatters into high-velocity rock projectiles, inflicting severe blunt force and penetrating trauma on the defenders. The earth itself became a hazard. The Krasnik uplands are covered in loess, a clay-rich soil that, when dry and pulverized by continuous artillery blasts, turns into a fine, choking dust. This pulverized loess mixed with the lubricating grease inside the Mauser Gewehr 98 rifles, creating an abrasive paste. The bolts jammed, stripping the infantry of their ability to maintain a defensive rate of fire. Compounding this localized friction was a total communication blackout. The Landwehr artillery batteries lacked basic field telephones, leaving forward units completely unable to call in counter-battery fire to suppress the Russian guns. The resulting attrition was absolute. Landwehr Infantry Regiment No. 51 suffered a total structural collapse, reduced from a full regiment to a single surviving combat battalion. Industrial warfare had weaponized the environment itself. The soil and the farm walls were dismantling the defending units before the enemy infantry even made contact. By 2300 hours, the battlefield was reduced to absolute visual obscurity, broken only by the swinging, stark white glare of descending magnesium flares. In the pitch black, Ordnance Officer Bernard Stolberg initiated a desperate bayonet charge against the Russian trenches. He reached the enemy line, only to realize he was alone. Stolberg recorded in his diary that his older reserve troops had, quote, gradually all slipped away into the night. The melting away of these reserves represented a hard, measurable biological threshold, the somatic stop line. It is the point where the human body can no longer physically execute kinetic action, regardless of military discipline or orders. This wireframe models physiological collapse. First, rapid caloric depletion. Lacking field kitchens, bodies had no fuel. Second, nervous system exhaustion. Continuous artillery vibrations induced involuntary tremors, preventing sleep. Third, trench foot. Trapped in waterlogged boots, the foot's epidermal barrier began sloughing. Stolberg's men hit a rigid biological boundary. The physiological machinery of these older reservists simply broke down under the weight of sustained industrial stress. On the morning of September 9th, the environmental parameters shifted drastically. Torrential, continuous rain began to fall over the Tarnawka sector. The water saturated the dry loess soil, rapidly transforming the fine dust into a highly viscous, sticky clay mud. This created a severe logistical crisis for the Austro-Hungarian 3rd Heavy Artillery Brigade, as they attempted to reposition their 15-centimeter howitzers. The wet loess mud acted as a physical trap. The shear stress and extreme suction effect of the clay clamped tightly around a heavy iron-rimmed artillery wheels. The brigade's exhausted, underfed draft horses simply lacked the kinetic force required to break that suction. The guns were completely immobilized. As Russian infantry closed in on the bogged-down positions, the artillery crews had to make a desperate choice. They inserted explosive charges to spike the barrels, permanently disabling their own weapons, and abandoned the heavy guns in the mud. This single environmental failure had an immediate strategic consequence. The loss of the 3rd Heavy Artillery Brigade stripped General Dankel of his only remaining defensive firepower. Operational mobility is entirely subordinate to environmental physics. Without the ability to extract and reposition their artillery, the Austro-Hungarian defensive line suffered an irreparable rupture. This map tracks the final collapse. With the Austro-Hungarian right wing breaking at Tarnawka, General Pleve's Russian Fifth Army poured directly into that undefended 50-mile void. This deep flanking maneuver bypassed the front lines entirely, moving to sever Dankel's primary supply arteries through Janov-Lubelski. Facing total encirclement, General Dankel had only one option left. He abandoned the entire northern offensive, ordering a disorganized general retreat back across the San River. Down at the microscopic level of the Tarnawka battlefield, local peasant Jan Zayants documented the aftermath in his handwritten manuscript, describing the physical remains across his village as frightfully horrifying. He detailed a grim harvest. The corpses of multi-ethnic soldiers littered the high fields, lying packed together, quote, like sheaves of wheat. The finalized casualty metrics confirmed the scale of the slaughter. The German Landwehr's 11th and 51st Infantry Regiments were structurally decimated, leaving only 2 hollowed-out battalions where thousands of men had stood days prior. The ensuing retreat triggered a total collapse of tactical mobility. Wounded men had to be hauled by hand through miles of freezing mud, sparking immediate widespread outbreaks of typhus and cholera. By February 1915, local civilians were conscripted to dig massive trenches in the frozen ground to bury the dead and prevent pestilence, forming what is now the Tarnawka Military Cemetery. The 3 days at Tarnawka proved a brutal reality of the new century. The raw courage of linear infantry charges could not overcome the calculating physics of modern artillery. Modern warfare is governed by a ruthless, forensic mathematics, and in that equation, human physiology will always be the ultimate unbreakable limit.